Okay, so welcome back to New 303. This is Lecture 7 on Emptiness and Plenitude. So in brief, the last lecture, or lecture in 3 parts on saints or wizards, we started by talking about parasites, but that was something of a leftover and aside. What we really started was talking about the kinds of traditions of saints and wizards, or saints or wizards, which is to say specialist practitioners within any given society who seem to be deeply concerned with control over their altered states as a means of appropriating their own self-development, that is to say, as a means of intentional self-transformation. And within the context of their metaphysics, of course, world transformation, which is something we're going to pick up on more as we go. But for now, let's keep it within the frame of sort of self-transformation. So among other things in that context, we started by looking very briefly at these sort of shamanic traditions of early human history and the psychotechnologies that are associated with that, namely, and it's sort of chiefly among them, trance, and the various systems that accompany trance, right? So technologies of intervention, drumming, chanting, right? Certain kinds of exogenous psychoactives, etc., and how those things work together in the context of ritual to produce certain kinds of states, like soul flight, right? Where one seemingly is leaving their body in order to either sort of survey the material world in some view from above fashion, or to parlay with sort of sovereign powers, external spirits and sovereign powers in order to gain power oneself, to gain information, et cetera, et cetera. We looked at how those things begin to branch out into the sort of conventional religious traditions that we think of, and mostly the pre-axial religions, right? So they begin to sort of concretize into religious traditions as we start to see more permanent settlements and civilizations turn up. And we also see simultaneously this differentiation into magical practices, much of this on both sides cemented by the psychotechnology of literacy, of text. We then considered at some greater length how that particular psychotechnology of text can influence the mind. And we looked specifically at construal levels, adding the construal levels of sort of gestalt and featural onto the sort of existing axis of the space we're gradually constructing of opacity and transparency. We discussed a little bit how the technologies, the psychotechnologies, right, of mindfulness and of metta, right, as examples in the Indian subcontinent, correspond to that sort of two-dimensional system. That, in a sense, right, mindfulness is a repeated practice in which one is training oneself to drag themselves down, or that makes it sound negative, but to pull themselves down towards an opaque and featural level, right? And that is typically paired with a kind of metta space after time, where one is expanding themselves out, an expanding wave of loving kindness, of compassion, that is pushing one further out into the transparent and the gestalt. And that these two things are paired so that you are operating them, again, in an opponent process fashion, right? There's kind of tug of war so that you're strengthening both sides and creating greater cognitive flexibility. We also looked at the Doctrine of Signatures, which is to say the tables of correspondence, et cetera, that come out of the sort of pre-scientific, pre-causal framework of knowledge creation, where knowledge was constructed by association, right? An analogical system whereby the world was subdivided under sort of a certain number of powers, and that tranches, slices of those systems, right? Like a giant spreadsheet could be used to navigate and interpret in some important sense, right, phenomena within the world. And that has applications within divination, but it also has applications within certain spaces where one is attempting to navigate these things, so that by entering a, say, auto-hypnotic or trance state, right, one is dissociating, but then one has a kind of ability to employ what Umberto Eco called hermetic drift in order to make one's way through the associative chain that they've internalized, relying both on literacy but also on things like the Ars Memoria, sort of dramatized in the idea of the memory palace. So having internalized this system, this gives the ability to use hermetic drift to navigate through systems of meaning. And lastly, we talked a little bit about how those same tables of correspondence, right, the Doctrine of Signatures, could be used to construct a kind of symbolic amplifier, such that when one was in a kind of transparent and signifying state, furnishing an area, a space conceptually with things which were linked to the concept, the slice that you had extracted from the system that you were trying to make contact with, would allow you to navigate, but also to focus your attention when it strayed, right, back in the direction of the kind of conceptual core of what you're getting at, the conceptual and effective core of what you're getting at, so that in a sense it acts as an additional kind of cognitive prosthesis, a way of managing your attention in the direction that you want it to be managed. And then we briefly talked about the Nerathian Bootstrap, which I won't recap here, but this is part of the general thesis we're constructing, that in many cases what is happening here is that one is gaining the ability to sort of, as per the ship of Theseus, lift themselves off the decks so that they can effect repairs, right? So that they can shift their footing around in various ways. So we're going to be expanding on some of that today. So the very first thing that I want to talk about is expanding, first off, this idea of the sort of mindfulness and metta, right? The mindfulness and metta. So, right, as I mentioned before, right, initial practice in virtually every tradition of meditation, what we used to call contemplation in the West, involves learning the discipline to keep your attention focused in one place, on a candle flame, on the tip of your nose, on the single syllable of a mantra, whatever that particular object happens to be, right? The idea is to give yourself something that you are focusing your attention on and basically train yourself in a basic sense to keep your attention more or less focused. Once that core skill is acquired, right, then usually it is employed in various kinds of other meditations. And there are many, many meditations. Even if you look at, any one of the sort of Buddhisms, right, there are meditations which are specific to one's condition, situation, etc. So we have a very pared down idea of meditation, sort of in the current scientific West. The McMindfulness movement, such as it is, has really trimmed things into a very sanitized and reduced, and to some extent bowdlerized version of things, where we have kind of a basic notion. And in fact, meditations and contemplations might range all over the place depending on circumstances. So it was not uncommon for a teacher to assign specific kinds of meditations and contemplations to a student in order to combat specific issues. So one rather striking example within various Buddhisms is that, say, a student who found that their path was preoccupied by one of the three defilements, right? Lust. So the three defilements are lust, greed, and greed and hatred, I think. I should remember that off the top of my head, but it's early. Right, but the point is lust. So people who were defiled by lust, right? So, they're attempting to meditate, but they're consumed with sort of bodily cravings and sexual images and so on and so forth, would be counseled to engage in a contemplation, a kind of visualization, where they pictured the object of their affection, they pictured the object of their attention, of their lust, right, as being composed of viscera. So they were sort of supposed to give them like a mental autopsy in a certain sense, right? Pull them apart so that they realized that they were, made of meat and bone and filled with various kinds of foulness. That seems a little harsh, since everybody obviously is in fact biological, so far as I can tell. But nevertheless, you understand the basic idea, right? There is engaged in lust a kind of highly selective idealization that often doesn't admit this kind of biology. And so you can extend that, right? You pull somebody apart and realize that they're full of these things. You pull it further apart, right? Pull the image further apart and say, mentally contemplate a concept of death, of decay, right? Picture them as a corpse, picture them rotting, etc. The idea being that this is a kind of direct counter that's meant to break up the idealized and narrowly aspectualized sort of images that are occurring with lust and temper them. So that's just one example. But the point is that there's an entire range within any given tradition of meditations and contemplations. Now, there are also, within most traditions, sort of various stages of meditative and mystical attainment. And some of the depths of that we're going to cover further on, because we're going to talk about them in the context of insight and flow and some of the ideas that come around that. But there are some notions that I want to introduce here. So when we're talking about this mindfulness and metta practice, okay, as a kind of a two-phase practice, right? So first, learn to focus the attention, then learn to focus the attention minimally to bring attention down into this space, right, where it is both featural and opaque, right, and hold it there, strengthen that. That's going to tend to, on release, cause a kind of snap back, right? So in most cases where you have an opponent process in a system, if you pull way far off on one side, you tend to get a snapback when the system is released, right? It overcorrects onto the other side. A good example of this that people are familiar with is weeping, right? Weeping, that experience of spontaneously being overwhelmed and experiencing tears, is often a kind of snapback that occurs, right, in the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems when they're in opponent process. Circumstances change and all of a sudden, boosh, right? It's over on the other side and you're sort of overflowing. So a system will tend to sort of snap back. So you're pulling yourself down, 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 right, into the one corner, and then it's going to tend to snap back. So where does it snap back to? It snaps back up into, right, the highly gestalt and the highly transparent, right? So what we see is that first, you learn to focus your attention, then you learn to pull down to the featural and the gestalt, which, the featural and the opaque, which in and of itself is a somewhat unusual position to be in, which is why it's a starting position, right? For the most part, our minds tend to stray towards the associative. We tend to seek meaning. We tend to, right, allow our thoughts to proceed one after another, sort of in a ceaseless chain. So pulling this down is an important first step, right? You have to learn a certain amount of control and get some sort of gaps in that flow, right, to dissociate yourself, in fact, from the chain of thought so that you don't identify with it in the same way. But then you pair it with this other practice, metta. And in metta, you have the expanding wave of compassion and loving kindness, in which you're expanding it to your loved ones, people who are neutral to you, your enemies, or people who deem you to be their enemy, right? People that you have issues with, beef with, right? And outwards and onwards, and to include all beings, all sentient beings, perhaps all beings in the universe. This highly expansive movement is, of course, corresponding to this other thing. And so you're training, as I mentioned, cognitive flexibility. However, there is a next stage. And the next stage is this. This is the typical procession. First, you're just learning basic focus. Then you start doing mindfulness. Once your mindfulness practice is relatively speaking established with all the sort of supports that go with that, and there may be various language of training supports, energetic work, breath work, certain kinds of ethical work, etc. But once you have that practice relatively established, then you introduce metta, expansive metta. But eventually, rather than say spending one session doing mindfulness, and then the next sitting session doing metta, you begin to alternate them within a single session. Half of a seated meditation you spend in mindfulness, and half of it you spend in metta. And that back and forth, okay, alternation is gradually sort of brought into alternation until such point as you achieve the state which is called prajna. Now, prajna, literally speaking, means wisdom, but the idea of prajna in this context is that what it represents is a simultaneity, the simultaneous ability to engage in both mindfulness and metta. Now, what does that mean? Because, when we look at this sort of from the outset, especially in the way that we've been sketching it within this two-dimensional space, which, as I mentioned, the map is not the territory. So take this with a grain of salt, but it gives us some conceptual handles to work with. When we're considering this within that kind of two-dimensional space, those two things are opposites, right? They're opposites. So what would it mean to experience them at the same time? How would that even work, right? That's like saying I'm going forwards and backwards at the same time, right? Or is it? Like, does it mean that? So here is where I want to pause for a little bit and detour to talk more about integration. We've talked substantially so far about dissociation, and we've talked about integration insofar as integration yields transparency, right? The idea that integration is transparency is trust, right? The sort of the passage through one thing to another is a kind of transparency, is integration, is trust, right? When we trust something, we take it transparently. We don't pull back and opaquely question it, right? We don't check to see if it's okay. We just go straight through. We've talked about that at some length, but we spent more time talking about, I almost did opponent processing. We spent more time talking about dissociation, where a previously transparent and a previously integrated system, right, dissociates out to the point where the two systems have a kind of apparent autonomy relative to each other. So, right, if you are part of a kind of core complex, right, your consciousness is part of a core complex, and a subsystem pulls away from that, if you have an experience of that subsystem, you are going to experience it as being semi-autonomous. And we talked about this obviously in the context of sort of surgical interventions where, for instance, the corpus callosum is severed and all of a sudden the other hemisphere, typically the right, begins to behave in a fashion that is semi-autonomous as far as the left is concerned. But there are numerous other examples of this that we can see where dissociation occurs and semi-autonomous events are seeming to happen. Now, a note that I want to put here is, that dissociation is relative. Obviously, the system is not so dissociated from the sort of core complex, the core Phi complex, that consciousness is not aware of it at all. If it was so dissociated from it that consciousness is not aware of it at all, typically then we're dealing with a kind of complex in the psychodynamic sense, which is to say content that has become unconscious continues to operate, but does so entirely outside the bounds of conscious awareness. That does happen to people, as I mentioned. So people are influenced by their complexes. They might periodically be possessed by them, but typically their complexes operate on them sort of from outside the bounds of their awareness. And as I mentioned, there's sort of a standard bag of tricks that complexes use in this respect. Very often they sort of change the degree of salience on something. So they make something stand out or fade away, and they create emotional states, which, provided that you are identified with your thoughts and emotional states, will simply seem to be the case, right? They'll seem to be a feature of the world. So through those moves, they can get what they want, right? Insofar as they have a certain way of seeing things, a certain set of goals, et cetera, albeit in a limited fashion, they can influence the core consciousness into doing what they want simply by waving things in its face, hiding things where it can't see, and hitting you with emotions, which, if you are, right, somewhat naively identified with them, you're going to assume are the thing. So as an example, right, if you have, a classic shadow projection in this sense, you're going to experience projective anger at people, right? It has more to do with you than it has to do with them. This is the classic sort of hate at first sight experience, the complementary to love at first sight, but it's got more to do with you than it has to do with them. You're projecting on them. But if you are sort of dissociated from that content far enough, it's not going to seem that way. It's going to seem like a feature of them. It's going to seem like a fact about the world. So an instance of this that I'm sort of always fascinated by is what I dubbed many years ago Spock Buddhists. So Spock Buddhists are persons who, generally men, but I don't want to stereotype, but Spock Buddhists are persons who have pursued Buddhism essentially not as a kind of emotionally open and warm space, but as a means of repressing their emotions. And often they have decided, a bit like the Vulcans in Star Trek, hence Spock Buddhists, that they in fact, possess no emotions, that they experience no emotion, right? But the sort of observable feature of this, these people who believe that they're purely rational agents, is that they do still experience emotion. They just no longer have any control or association with it. They no longer experience even an identification with it. It seems to them to be entirely a feature of the world. So they'll still get very angry at people, noticeably angry. But if they're called on it, they will say, well, it's not that I'm angry, or it's the reason that I'm angry is because you're doing it, right? And I've encountered this a bunch of times. A friend of mine was married to a Spock Buddhist, and that was sort of my first encounter with this particular mode. As it turns out, this mode of emotional suppression is unfortunately not terribly modern or unique in the history of Buddhism. And we'll talk a little bit later about some of the interesting findings of the book Zen at War. This is sort of one of the great shames of Buddhism in a certain sense. Buddhism has had a good PR campaign for seeming like it is completely distinct from other religions and sort of ethically spotless in various ways. But of course, there are, in fact, numerous instances where Buddhist populations, including monks and other specialists, have engaged in quite nasty behavior. And one of those things was the throwing in of Japanese Buddhists with the Imperial Japanese military during World War II, in which they basically taught meditation techniques, Zen meditation techniques, but in a weaponized fashion. So they taught people basically to suppress their emotions in order to become more efficient killing machines and warriors, which seems like it doesn't really square with the basics of Buddhism. It is, in fact, a much more kind of classically Hindu idea, as per the Bhagavad Gita, right? The final revelation of Krishna to Arjuna, where he says, I have become death, destroyer of worlds. I already killed all these guys, so get out there and do your job. When Arjuna is expressing his reluctance to kill his cousins at the Battle of Kurukshetra, the place of the spear. And so the final revelation, after all the other religious revelations that Krishna, his charioteer, makes, is, I'm God and I'm time and I've devoured all these people. They're already dead in the grand scheme of things. You can't destroy their immortal soul. So get out there and kill those guys, right? That's a very kind of caste system utilitarian consequence of that doctrine. And that seems much more in line with what Zen was doing, like suppress your emotion with meditation to make yourself a more efficient killing machine. So the point is, this general notion of the Spock Buddhist is, it turns up here and there, and is generally considered, right, doctrinally to be sort of an aberration of the path. It's not that you're supposed to be emotionless, but the Spock Buddhist takes it that way. And by so doing, they're highly dissociated from their emotional material. They're unable to take ownership over it. And consequently, because it's so dissociated, they don't have much control over it. They don't have conscious contact with it. Getting conscious contact means bringing it closer, but there's a catch. You can't bring it too close, because then it reintegrates into the system, right? And then it's no longer sort of operable. It's locked in, a la the ship of Theseus and the notion of the Nerathian Bootstrap. So there is a kind of middle ground. One wants to dissociate just far enough that there is the seeming autonomy, right? While keeping within a range of communication. There's a fine balance involved here. So we've talked a lot about the dissociative side, but let's talk a bit about the integration side. So when we're talking about integration in this sense, okay, and bearing in mind this idea of the potential integration of mindfulness and metta into prajna, the simultaneity, the first jumping off point that I want to use, because it's sort of central to my own work around this idea, is to bounce off Tononi's notion of integrated information theory. Okay, so that's Giulio Tononi and its integrated information theory. The basics of this theory, we're not going to cover this exhaustively by any stretch, but the basics of this theory is that consciousness is a property that arises from any sufficiently complex system involving integrated information. Okay, integrated information. Now, there are a number of interesting consequences of this, and he talks in his sort of early papers on this about the notion of the Phi Complex, which is to say a region of integrated information, right, arising. And very specifically, he talks about there being sort of a primary Phi Complex, right, for instance, within the brain that would be associated with consciousness. Now, since that time, he has expanded his purview. And when I sort of wrote my early expansions of his work, one of the things that I pointed out is that, right, there's no reason to believe that if the brain is capable of generating one Phi complex, right, that it is not capable of generating more than one Phi complex, which is to say that if we assume that the basic machinery of the brain is capable of generating consciousness, right, it's not clear at all that it is limited to generating one, right? Now, the other critique here is that the original formulations of integrated information theory, these Phi complexes, are relatively static in their presentation. There is a mathematical method of sort of calculating these things, which means that it yields some interesting predictions, like of all of the insects, for instance, the honeybee should have among the highest Phi complex and therefore the most consciousness. Like you can sort of calculate this by looking at the complexity of their brain structures and so on and so forth, right? And bees are surprisingly smart. But it is nevertheless a relatively static kind of formulation, right? There's integrated information, but does that change? Does it evolve over time? Is it descriptive or proscriptive? Is this something that the brain seeks? Like, does it seek to complexify itself in integrated information, or does it, is this simply like a statement about the system? The other thing about it is, of course, that it is implicitly panpsychic. Where panpsychism is the idea that all things possess some measure of mind or some measure of consciousness. This is one of the kind of chief ways of addressing the problem of mind and body, right? A big unresolved problem within philosophy of mind, and frankly, within philosophy in general, something that cognitive science is very deeply concerned with. And, although the degree of integrated information is going to be variable, and therefore the degree of consciousness is going to be variable, you can look at any system as having some degree of integrated information and then possibly some kind of low-grade consciousness. This is an idea that I frankly find quite appealing, but there are sort of problematic issues, right? There are issues with panpsychism, right? Sort of unaddressed questions around it. If you are interested in that question, one of the best defenses of panpsychism sort of in the modern period is by Bill Seeger, who basically showed that panpsychism is not sort of ridiculous. There were many people treating this ridiculous, and it seems to be having something of a renaissance, panpsychism, to me, unsurprisingly. So despite the issues with it, there are some interesting implications. However, let's look at some of these other issues. So integrated information forms a Phi complex. Now, if we take away that static model of Phi complexes, how do we see the actual integration and dissociation of the brain occurring? And as I mentioned, the brain is in a constant state of flux and flow. There are periods of synchrony, right? There are periods of decoherence, right? So periods of coherence and periods of decoherence. And those periods of coherence and decoherence correlate, right? We can use this as a tracking measure for sort of the level of entropy in the brain. So we talked about this a little bit when we talked about the entropic brain hypothesis. There are a few other interesting issues that come out of that. So for instance, there's a set of fascinating experiments, absolutely fascinating. We don't have time to go into them in detail, but you can track the relative degree of entropy, the integration or entropy within the brain, by using phase space reconstruction, this mathematical technique to track people's eye motions when they're doing certain things and solving certain problems. Anyway, sorry, I'm digressing, I'm geeking out. But anyway, there's fascinating research here. We can talk about that. You can ask me about it if you're interested. The point is this idea of integration, right? So that is to say, right, relatively high, orderly, coherent firing and such in the brain, and a kind of decoherence, right? A kind of entropy, chaos, breakup. We know that that pattern is in constant flux. Neuroconnectivity is not static. And it's both not static in terms of the current firing patterns that are happening, but also not static in sort of a wet biological sense. So this is the analogy I already used, let's gross this people out, but your brain is not a dry mass of wires and computers. Your brain is much more like a bucket of worms, right? They're squirming around in there. They're in a state of Darwinian competition for resources. They form cooperative networks, right? And for sort of each of your brain cells, the brain itself is environment, right? These cells and the larger modules and stuff that they end up comprising together do not differentiate in a meaningful way between information received from the outside and information received from other parts of the brain. That plays into mutual modeling, etc. So when we're looking at this notion of the Phi complex of integrated information, it's important to note that those patterns and the scale and the degree of the integration is variable over time, okay? Further, we can show that there are regions that may be in relatively tight coherence, but separated out from other regions. That's basic to dissociation. So there may be a tight firing coherence, right, between two particular regions. In a sense, they are forming a space of integrated information, but that space is distinct from some larger state of integrated information. So those things operate in support of the idea that these Phi complexes, such as they are multiple. There's more than one, and they fluctuate. Right. And we talked a little bit about the analogy of the integration level with islands, right? Depending on where the water line is, you can either see islands as being independent, right? Or you can see them as being part of a mountain chain. If the water level is low, that is to say, if things are integrated, right, then what would appear to be three islands turns into three peaks of a mountain. It's a continuous mass with continuous transparency and information, right? So you can see that as the level, I mean, that's an analogy, but as this level fluctuates, right, you're going to tend to get spaces where you get a core Phi complex, and then things are going to separate out from it, right? Separate out from it. There's things in constant motion. Now, we know from doing a bunch of work around this kind of neuroscience question, right, that when things separate out, they take on that apparent autonomy, da-da-da-da-da. But let's talk a bit more about what it means when they integrate. What does it mean when information is integrated? Okay, so we have this abstract notion. We have this Phi complex, and Tononi has specifically linked to that notion to consciousness, importantly so, because among other things, it denotes a degree of consciousness. And this is very important for our purposes because we frankly need a lot of priming. There's something counterintuitive, I think, for many people about degrees of consciousness. In some ways, it's very acceptable, but people often default down to a kind of flip switch, right? A binary two-state idea about consciousness. You're either conscious or you're not conscious, right? And that doesn't seem to be the case if implied in this way, right? An organism may have consciousness, but it might have less consciousness. Now, I add that doesn't mean that it's sort of less important or that its feelings matter less or that it doesn't experience pain. I think we need to extend a much broader set of compassion and sympathy and empathy to other organisms, which we tend to use as sort of tools and slaves for the most part. However, right, there would be sort of degrees of consciousness and of the capacities of consciousness. But it also means that there are going to be degrees of consciousness within a single individual. There are going to be times when you are more and less conscious, right? And there are going to be persons who are more and less conscious. Now, that's very in keeping if we're looking at a kind of analysis, right, of the anecdotal evidence, such as it is, that we see in mystical traditions, right? Quite famously, the Buddha, when asked, are you a god? No. Are you a deva? No. Are you a demon? No. Are you a wizard? No. Well, what are you then? I am awake. Well, awake is a term that we use to signify a certain kind of consciousness. And if you consider expansions of this, like one thing that we'll talk about in the week on dreaming and lucid dreaming, we'll talk about the dream yogas of Naropa, which, among other things, purport the use of meditative techniques to intensify consciousness to the point that it carries through various states that we don't normally associate with consciousness. So they're conscious when they're awake, they're conscious when they're dreaming, which is to say lucid dreaming, but there are claims that an advanced practitioner of these systems can extend their consciousness until it pervades their NREM, until it pervades, right, so that they are simply conscious all of the time. It's an interesting idea, one that's frankly difficult to verify, but you can see how it fits into this. And I sometimes wonder, I have to admit, I sometimes wonder whether or not it would be good for us to be conscious all the time. That's hard to say. But it seems like that might have serious health consequences. And I have to admit, one of the things that I periodically look at, I've been interested in lucid dreaming, and I've been a practitioner for a long time. But I do sometimes wonder about how lucid dreaming impacts on sort of quality of sleep. And are you interfering with processes like, is your consciousness mucking around in a set of processes and memory consolidations that it ought not to? I wonder about that sometimes. There are advantages, obviously, to doing this sort of thing consciously, like you can do inner work and tackle phobias. That's been a common application with children. But are you stomping around as your system tries to go about its business? Anyway, interesting set of questions. So the point is, there would be sort of degrees of consciousness between individuals. and there would be degrees of consciousness within an individual. If you consider this, it's not hard, I suspect, for most of us to realize that there are definitely days when we are more and less conscious, right? There is, a state that accompanies a kind of peak experience state, right? We have a peak experience and we experience an intensification of consciousness. Typically, that is one of the primary markers of a sort of peak experience, as discussed by Maslow. We see an intensification of consciousness. Colors are brighter, details are more vivid. We feel as though we are more aligned, right? We feel sort of more embedded. Things seem realer in some important sense. There's a sort of hyper real, hyper clarity that goes with those moments. It's one of the things that renders them peak. We feel integrated, we feel embedded, we feel connected, and things are quite intense. Arguably within a higher integration state, that's what you're going to see. You're going to see an intensification of consciousness. But you can also think of times, possibly when you're in a borderline altered state, like, mild sleep deprivation, but also just, low points in your day. Your focus is down, your energy is down, you're missing things, right? So one of the markers of consciousness, again, we'll expand this more when we talk dream, is an ability to sort things in terms of context. So for instance, one of the tests which Tononi proposes for consciousness, and it's weird because he doesn't really unpack it, is that if a computer, for instance, possessed consciousness, if we created an artificial intelligence, it should be able to tell if an image is absurd. And the example that he gives is a potted rubber tree plant in the chair in front of a computer. It would be able to pick this up as weird. Now, weird in this sense is eliding a little bit. For those of you that are familiar with John Vervaeke's work, you will see the context of relevance realization here, right? Which is to say that when something is weird or when it's absurd in that way, right? What are you picking up on? You're picking up on the unusual sort of break in how those things are co-relevant. They don't seem like they go together. They don't seem co-relevant to each other, right? So his claim that a computer, right, an artificial intelligence that possessed consciousness would be able to pick up that this is weird or out of place is a question about its ability to pick up relevance and co-relevance. Likewise, if you consider the intensification of consciousness that occurs in lucid dreaming, right, that both hinges on but also produces an ability to pick up dream absurdity. The bizarreness of a dream becomes more obvious to us, right? When we are in a higher conscious state, it becomes more obvious to us. So things that would completely let slide, chimerical situations, bizarre fusions and mergers and blends and stuff, suddenly seem very weird to us, right? When we are lucid, they seem weird to us. And indeed, there's kind of circular bootstrap thing that goes on because detecting the weirdness is often how we get into a lucid dream. So we'll talk more about that when we get into it because it's an apparent paradox in a way. The point is that this intensification of consciousness, right, seems to yield an ability to sort of detect bizarreness, which is to say an increase in your ability to parse co-relevance. So when you are in a more a less conscious state, right? When you're sort of more dragging out, there are things that you're going to miss, right? You're not as sharp, you're not as acute, you're not as bright, right? These are the sorts of things we say. You can see how the metaphorical language around it shifts, but like there are details that we will miss, things, right, that will slip. You try to engage in the task and there are a bunch of small details and mistakes that you're making because you're not sort of picking up the co-relevance in as complex a manner, right? And you're not as able to sort of simultaneously balance both the featural level and the gestalt level, right? To tie it back. So degrees of consciousness. Now, what this also means, of course, is that if we sort of put all this together, we can operate on the assumption that there are going to be degrees of consciousness that will be affected when things integrate and dissociate. Right? So when the system integrates, it's increasing its degree of integrated information, right? Which is an intensification of consciousness. The previously dissociative model plugs in, there's an overall intensification of consciousness, but it also sort of plugs into the system in a transparent way that does not allow operation. It becomes part of the sort of core rules or premises of the system. So it can't be worked on in quite the same way. It can't be observed opaquely in the same way, but there is an intensification that goes with that. When, however, dissociates and pulls away, the core complex is going to be somewhat reduced, so it's going to lower itself in consciousness. And the complex that breaks away still has its own integrated information. It is an internal system. It's simply separated from this larger complex. Now, if we consider this notion that there are degrees and scales of this sort of thing, then we have to ask the question, to what extent does the component that has pulled away still possess some measure of consciousness? And that's an idea that we're going to come back to. It's obviously implicit in what we've been talking about complexes and sort of other parts. It's implicit, and we're going to unpack that more. But as I said, right now, integration. Okay, so integrated information. So I mentioned previously that one of the games kids very often like to play, right, is the spin around game as a mode of altered consciousness induction. And another classic, of course, is the like hang your head upside down off the couch so the room looks flipped upside down. This is delightful. But another game that kids sometimes will play is that they'll play with the integrated information or the dissociated information from their eyes. So I used to do this as a kid for many hours, which maybe says something about me. And I did it in a few different ways. So one of them was, okay, you're lying in bed and you're on your side and you can see whatever the mountain hump of your white pillow there, or whatever. And what you do is you're alternating between one eye and the other eye. You're shifting back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, right? If you do this, right, you can do it right now. You can take a pen and shift it, right? What you're going to see is that, of course, each eye is giving you a slightly different image, right? Each eye is giving you a slightly different image. Essentially speaking, your experience will be that if you do this, the pen will jump back and forth, because, of course, your eyes have slightly different perspectives on the world. Each of them is capturing a slightly variable aspect of visual information in space. Now, famously, of course, right, if you only have one such image, like if you lose an eye for whatever reason, then you don't have depth perception, right? Depth perception requires you to integrate these two streams. Now, for me as a kid, I was fascinated by this, partly because, it was like an easy experiment in consciousness. Not that I thought about it that way at the time, but it was an easy experiment in consciousness that I could do, sort of marveling about why things look different when you did this. But another big part of the reason was that until I was 9, I didn't have glasses. Everybody in my family had glasses and I didn't. And it seems to me that we kind of captured the fact of how blind I was relatively late. I'm quite blind, relatively late. And so aside from the fact that I typically couldn't see what was on the blackboard, I also had a lazy eye, right? So my eye tended to drift. So what would happen is that, if I was tired or some such, my one eye would drift off course. And if you've ever had this, what you get is double vision. Your vision separates out into two sort of wobbly, slightly blurry, partly overlapping images. Since I couldn't see what was going on at the board and I was sitting at the back of the classroom, I would often spend a significant amount of time deliberately allowing my lazy eye to stray off. So I would sort of entertain myself by taking an image and separating it, and then, right, controlling it, bringing it back together and separating it and bringing it back together, right? I would sort of control these images because I couldn't see what was up there anyway. And I often, frankly, wasn't paying attention to what the teacher was teaching. Depended on the subject, I suppose. So I did a lot of this, and that kept up, until basically the optometrist and my doctor caught on to this and informed me that I would need corrective glasses, because if my eye continued to do this, allegedly, eventually my brain would reconcile the difference between these two streams of information by just shutting off one of my eyes. Basically, it would like neurologically cut power to one of my eyes. And so I would become, in that sense, cyclopean. And obviously, I didn't want that since it was going to mess with my depth perception. So there was some notion that I might have to wear an eye patch for a while, which I did for a scratched cornea, but not for that. But basically, they had to keep an eye on it, and I got corrective lenses, which largely adjusted the problem, although not completely. When I get tired, I will typically unconsciously close my right eye and continue to read with my left, which I think is maybe stronger. So I typically, if I notice that I've closed my right eye, that's often a sign it's time for me to go to bed. Okay, so playing with this line, right, with the double vision, the blurry vision, or doing this thing where you're switching eyes back and forth, consider again, bring the pen up in front of yourself and close your eyes successfully, watch the pen jump back and forth. Now it's notable, right, that when that information is integrated in your brain, when it's integrated into your experience, you don't get it in a strict additive fashion. You don't simply experience the one image plus the other image, because if you did, you would just experience two pens or two pencils. And that's not what you experience. What happens instead is that there is an integration of that information such that the two images are combined, right? So you only see one pen, one pencil, but with an additional dimension of information, depth. So the two images are combined in such a way as to provide an entire additional dimension of information, one that is not easily derivable, right, from like a mono image. A mono image has no depth. And so, right, the integration of those two things it's not simply additive, it synthesizes them into something that has an additional degree of information, has depth. Take that as a kind of general principle for what we're going to be talking about from here. That if you can get a kind of simultaneity of two streams of information and successfully integrate them, synthesize them, that what you typically get is depth. Now, that kind of convergent depth-producing integration is in fact something that we see all over the place. We see it in multiple senses. So we've already talked about hemispheric integration, right, in a particular way, but hemispheric integration also provides the spatial aspects of sound, right? So your ability to spatialize a sound, if one of your ears is out, you can hear a sound, it's quiet or loud, but you're not going to get any sense of directionality, right? On the other hand, if it's quieter one than the other, then you're going to sort of have a sense of directionality. Again, the integration of those two streams provides depth, right? It provides a certain kind of depth, a dimensionality, right, that a single stream of information does not provide. We also tend to use sensory material in a convergent fashion. We integrate sensory material in a convergent fashion to establish the reality of events. So, the sort of simple version of this is like, okay, when people go to a 3D movie, you don't see it so much anymore, but you take kids to a 3D movie, right? You all put your 3D glasses on and the butterflies come out of the screen and you'll see kids doing what? This, right? And you used to see adults doing that, not so much anymore. This. Why? Because they can see it and they can hear it, and it has an apparent location in space. That's how 3D movies work. They specifically, right, feed distinct information. So either with sort of independently polarized lenses or sometimes liquid shutter technology. But the point is they're feeding you a slightly different image to each eye in order to, right, provide that sense of depth. So they can see, here's the butterfly floating around, but they want an independent confirmation. They go like this because if they can also touch it, what? Well, it's real. And the fact that they can't touch it is delightful because it's jarring, right? It's disconfirmation. And so it's, right, illusory. But the point is, like, why do this? Do this to get independent confirmation from an independent sense, touch. There is a form of schizophrenia, I can't remember if I mentioned this already, but there's a form of schizophrenia, which is absolutely terrifying, in which people will see things, relatively common, hear things, very common, almost ubiquitous, actually, for positive symptoms of schizophrenia. So they'll say, see somebody and be talking to them. But then when they go to confirm in some way, they reach out and they also experience tactile hallucinations. So they reach out and they touch them, or they apparently touch them because it's hallucinatory. And this is terrifying because that is, it's being trapped in the matrix, right? It's some kind of hell dimension, right? Where you really cannot trust the convergence of your senses. But what's horrifying about that? Well, what's horrifying about it is that it's multi-channel in a way that undermines our ability to establish independent reality and independent truth. Note that we also use this kind of convergence technique when we're establishing knowledge with each other. So if you're at a house party and maybe in the country, and somebody kind of runs in and says, I just saw a unicorn in the woods. Odds are they're going to get laughed at, right? People are going to be like, I think you've had a bit too much, time to slow down, right? However, if one person runs in and says, I just saw a unicorn in the woods, and another person runs in and says, I just saw a unicorn in the woods, you're going to take this somewhat more seriously. You may still chalk it up as folie à deux, right? There's like folly of two, or, you know, like mutual madness between two people. You might just chalk it up and laugh it off. If a third person runs in and says, I just saw a unicorn in the woods, you're going to go check, right? You may take it quite seriously, like people will tend to be excited. There's also something here about the rule of threes, which is to say that if we can get three independent convergent sources on something, we typically take that to be considerably realer. I suspect this has something to do with embedded cognition and spatialization. You can think about this, as I've mentioned in other places, also with regard to like the basics of essay design. So have you ever wondered, like the 5-paragraph essay, why do you have 3 arguments? Why not 2? Why not 1? Why not 4? Why 3? Why is 3 the basic unit? And there's something about threes, right? You know, 3 wishes and so on and so forth. There's something about 3, and I think it has something to do with 3-dimensionality in space, right? It allows us to tightly triangulate and localize things in space, and that basic notion accepts itself basically into our conceptual framework. But anyway, leaving that aside. So, you know, if 3 people run in and say that they saw a unicorn, odds are you're going to take that quite seriously. So our intersubjective convergence, right, is also about convergence and integration, right, between various forms of information. Accounts may be slightly different, but we will tend to take them in an integrationist fashion and take that to be closer to the truth. So again, there is this idea that with integration comes depth. Okay. Now, we also know that, you know, every time 2 sort of brain states or, you know, mental states are co-occurring, they're building up connections to each other. What fires together, wires together, right? What fires together, wires together. This is the basic sort of rule of neuroplasticity. So when 2 things are co-occurring, they start forming links, sometimes tenuous and initially long links, but the more that happens, the more it thickens. Right? This is how a kind of coherence of firing, right, and transparency builds up. As 2 things fire together, they wire together. So consider this again in the acquired synesthetic sense of literacy, right? We expose people to the letter and they make the sound. We expose the letter, they make the sound. We expose the letter until eventually that system of transparency is so automatic that in fact agency cannot easily intervene on it at all. You know, you can't choose not to read things, right? It becomes a pretty much autonomous system, not fully, because it seems that both meditation and hypnosis can intervene on it, but largely, right? It becomes sort of girded in automaticity, right? The linkage becomes thick enough. So what fires together, wires together. Well, what that means is that clearly it's not the case in some sense that things have to happen literally simultaneously for those links to fire. Otherwise, we would not be able to form chains of co-occurrence, right? We wouldn't be able to look at causality or correlation, right? And so correlation very often is one thing then another thing. Now, the broader that gap is, the harder it is for correlation to form. This, incidentally, is one of the reasons for the design of certain kinds of pharmaceuticals that are used, for instance, in the treatment of ADHD. So ADHD is traditionally treated with stimulants of various kinds, amphetamines and sort of close stimulant analogs like Ritalin, which is kind of chemically analogous to cocaine, as I mentioned, right? And what are the problems with these things? Well, one of the problems with them is that because they are dopaminergic, right? If you take a pill and then 5 minutes later, right, there is this sort of, dopamine increase. Temporarily speaking, that's going to be motivational and focusing. You're going to find more meaning in things. You're going to get a link. But very rapidly, your system is going to figure out, right, that it can shortcut itself straight to the head by just taking the pill, right? That link becomes a very short link. And so the closer together those two things are, the more likely they are to get tangled together, and the more likely you are to start forming sort of habit forming problems, right, around it. So lots of the more current drugs are, essentially speaking, prodrugs or slow release, which is to say that you take the pill, right, but your system has to do sort of one full metabolic pass on the chemical before it gets the stimulant, or the stimulant is coded in such a way as to release in your body after a period of time and slowly. Basically, you're broadening out the link so that it's not easy to make the association, right? Now, that kind of association making stuff, right, is partly, in fact, is a function of consciousness, your ability to make links over long periods. And we know that, animals and young children often do not possess a very broad lens of association. So a mistake that happens fairly often in parenting is like a kid does something and then they're punished for it later. And the punishment or whatever is so far from the initial thing that that link isn't really drawn, right? Much as we'll talk about when we talk about flow, immediate feedback is key for forming proper associations, right? So you need tight feedback. Not that I'm a big fan of punishing, period, but we'll come around to that. So the point is that by delaying that gap, right, you're delaying the association. So what that tells us is that there is, in fact, a variable breadth in which two things can become associated. They can become, right, connected with long links, wire together and fire together. They do not literally have to happen at the same time to start those links forming. So when we get a kind of relatively rapid alternation, for instance, looking at the shape of the letter and then the sound, and then the shape of the letter and then the sound, shape of the letter, sound, eventually speaking, the links that form between those things thicken to the point where the one becomes predictive of the other. That's what it means for them to be coherent. That's what it means for them to be integrated and transparent. When the one fires, it causes the other one to fire quite predictably, basically in instantaneous response. Right? There may also be mutual modeling stuff happening there where, they're consulting with their own models of each other to reduce long-range communication. But the point is that the basics of it are that, right, at first it's like one, and then that's predictive of this, and one and predictive of this, one and predictive of this. But eventually that is going to thicken to the point where one, ba-boom, 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 into a kind of simultaneity or near simultaneity, okay? And if it operates both ways, right, if you both look at the letter and that then you make the sound, but also you make the sound and then issue the letter, you're going to form it in both directions, right? So that the two things will be co-activating. So same kind of thing with other states, with other kinds of systems. If we fire together, we wire together. And initially, there's going to be a bit of a switch. But can you see how now we're starting to get towards, okay, the integration, potentially speaking, of mindfulness and metta? First, you train your attention. Then you focus on the opaque and the featural. Then you start focusing on the gestalt and the transparent. Then you start alternating them, right, day over day. Then you start alternating them within a session. Then you alternate them more, right? And as we're doing this, we're gradually building them into a kind of co-predictive exchange. We're wiring them together until eventually it becomes possible to co-activate them. Right? In a sense, you can do both. You are simultaneously pulling down to the featural and the opaque, but also expanding out, right? And prajna, wisdom, as they call it. Now, that's an overview, right? Obviously, it's a very schematic take in a certain sense on this. I want to talk a little bit more about sort of mechanisms of simultaneity and mechanisms of synthesis and the transcendent specifically. So this is one of the things that that Jungian depth psychology is actually very deeply concerned with. Jungian depth psychology is very deeply concerned with a kind of dialectic synthesis and integration. Okay, so the notion of dialectic is, of course, about the interplay of opposites, and depth psychology sort of makes its point, and it's bouncing off a number of other thinkers that precede. So Jung is referencing Hegel, among others, and the Hegelian system, essentially speaking, is a system of dialectic. It's about pairs of seeming sort of opposites that gradually synthesize together into higher and higher modes, right? And this moving in a particular direction. We do not have the space to unpack Hegel at great length. But the point is, Jung is drawing on that to some extent. He says, essentially speaking, we tend to parse things into opposites, right? But that the way forward into sophistication is for us to synthesize those opposites. right? And indeed, he proposes something called the Transcendent Function. And the Transcendent Function, in a large part, its role is to effect this kind of synthesis. We see sort of numerous things in earlier esoteric literature, things like Hermeticism and alchemy, right? Which you'll see sort of linked in with some of the magical stuff we were talking about, that are references to these kinds of techniques on a psychospiritual level. So one is the axiom of Maria Prophetessa, which is, roughly speaking, at first there is the one begets the two begets the three, and the three begets the fourth, which is the one. Okay. Now, that was an alchemical dictum and an ancient one. And like much alchemy, it requires significant interpretation. However, another sort of central notion in alchemy is the central sort of transformative idea of solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. Now, all these things in alchemy, which we'll talk more about later, but all these things in alchemy, right, relate to physical process. But the idea, Jung's idea around alchemy specifically, was that physical process was a kind of projective substrate, a way to externalize psychological contents, right, through projection, so that you could work on them externally, right, and thereby, in a kind of macrocosm, microcosm way, effect internal change, right? So the idea is you project your contents outside of yourself. And I want to point out that that's not intrinsically all that strange, right? Consider the idea of chair work, as we recently discussed it. Projecting your contents outside of yourself, and not so far outside of yourself that you lose them, but far enough outside of yourself that they have semi-autonomy, right, is actually a really powerful way to separate them out from your core complex so that you can engage in a bit of negotiation with them, right? So that you can see them clearly, so that you can alter them, so that you can talk to them, etc., right? To separate them out. So the Jung's notion of alchemy was that psychic contents were essentially projected into physical process. Well, within that context, what's solve et coagula, right? There are lots of different physical processes and operations and stuff. I mean, alchemy is very esoteric if you're just coming at it. But the basics of it are that the process is always about dissolving things, right, and coagulating them. So bringing them together and separating them out, bringing them together and separating them out, right? Bringing them together and separating them out. And that process repeatedly was supposed to yield a refinement, a kind of refinement. Well, you know, the link I'm obviously going to make here is that that sounds a great deal like integration and dissociation. But importantly, if you have in a system simultaneous integration and dissociation, that is to say, simultaneous integration and differentiation, what you then have is complexification. A system becomes more complex to the extent that it is, right, simultaneously integrating and differentiating or dissociating, right, pulling apart, separating. I already mentioned that this, you know, is something that we see really obviously in sort of biological development, right? So a fetus starts as a single cell. It then replicates into a mass of identical single cells, right? A blastocyte. But eventually those individual cells, stem cells, start to differentiate into specific organ types. And as the body develops, right, those individual, you know, the bone cells, the brain cells, the heart cells, the muscle cells, et cetera, as they separate out, they don't just become dissimilar to each other and fly off in all directions. They become dissimilar to each other, right? They differentiate while simultaneously building up dense networks of physical, you know, connection, right? Nerves, blood vessels, lymph, etc. Chemical systems of connection between each other, right? Electrical pattern connection, etc. They develop really dense networks of connection. They're integrating, but simultaneously differentiating. That is to say that they organize, literally organs organize, right? And that is a complexification. It is that kind of complexification that yields the developmental progress that enables an organism, as it becomes more complex, to have capacities that it simply did not have before, right? There are things that a 1-year-old is capable of that a fetus can't handle. There are things that a 6-year-old is capable of that a 1-year-old can't. There are things that you are capable of that a 6-year-old can't. Part of the process that we're talking about here, of course, is intervening on one's own process, developmental process, because those processes, in a sense, biologically get you to a certain point, but after that, it's the role of effort and culture, et cetera, to continue that kind of differentiation integration and thus complexification, right? On the level of the brain, the mind. You have to sort of, it's so complicated that you have to sort of intervene. You have to appropriate your own self-development to engage in intentional self-transformation. But the point of that is that so doing is going to tend to yield, right, new capacities. In the same way as that kind of complexification and development yields new capacities, right, just naturally biologically, when we try to drive these things, which is still natural and biological, but you know my point. When we drive these things, we are building new capacities, right? Psychotechnologies are a good example of this. You're giving yourself a capacity that, you simply just do not have as part of your basic genetic framework. So, so this idea in alchemy, right, the sort of solve et coagula is about this. And the axiom of Maria Prophetissa is, again, this kind of like, first there is the one, and the one begets the two, right? So a thing sort of produces its opposite in some sense. The two beget the three, right? So they, in some way, come together. There is like a parent and child dynamic, right? And that in some way begets the fourth, that is the one, right? That is a basic principle. You can take that with a great big grain of salt, if you're so inclined. But the idea here basically is, right, as we start to see co-occurrence, we're going to see linkages. As those linkages thicken up, we're going to tend to see a kind of integrated thing. And then the question is about sort of transcending the opposite. So what does that mean? Okay. So first off, one of the things that I like to point when we're talking about opposites, right? People tend to frame things off in opposites. And sometimes this is a question of identity, right? I'm a this and not a that, and so on and so forth. So it can be quite attached. Anything that attaches to identity is going to tend to rouse extremely powerful emotions from people. But a lot of the time, these oppositions are they're not simple opposites in some sense. So think about things that people list as opposites, okay? Imagine that you were asking somebody the opposite. Okay, the opposite of positive, negative. The opposite of day, night. The opposite of black, white, right? Okay, those seem relatively straightforward. The opposite of good, evil, right? We go through those opposites. But consider these opposites. When somebody says the opposite of man, woman, that's an answer you would get a lot, right? The opposite of dog, cat. Now, ask yourself the question, is that the same kind of opposite as the kind of logical opposite that we're talking about with positive and negative, or the kind of opposite we're talking about with true and false? Like, some of these things seem to be in some sense, literally, logically opposite, right? Sort of irreconcilable, right? So this is Aristotle's notion of the excluded middle, right? Something is true or false. There's no middle ground. That, of course, is a notion that's been roundly challenged with fuzzy logic and some Bayesian work and so on and so forth. But like, taking it for a second, right? Okay, they're opposites, right? Matter and antimatter. Fine, matter and antimatter are opposites, and if they collide, they can't both be there. They explode and turn back in energy, right? Black and white are not sort of co-occurrent, although, as it turns out, perceptually, they're actually on a spectrum. A shade can appear white in one context and black in the other, like that dress that lit the internet up for a while. Like, context plays a lot into color perception. The point is that there are certain things that we think of as being logical opposites, but in what sense are man and woman logically opposite? We share an overwhelming amount of DNA, right? We are far more similar in appearance than we are different, right? Relative to other species and things, right? It is a relative opposition. And I've talked about this before when I talk about the kind of relativizing effect that two close things have, right? So my Irish friend who was angry at being mistaken for being English would have been indistinguishable to somebody from sufficiently far away. That was the problem that she faced. Her accent was insufficiently distinct from their perspective from English, but for her, that's an important distinction and probably an opposition. Irish is, in some sense, the opposite of English. Now, obviously, they have much more in common than they have different. Man and woman clearly have much more in common than they have different, right? The vast majority. There may, in fact, be differences, right? Genetic differences, cultural differences, etc. But the point is that does that make them opposite in the sense that something is logically opposite? In the same way, right, cat and dog, that's one that throws me all the time. The opposite of cat is dog. I find this very strange, right? Well, let's take dog. What's the opposite of dog? Well, the opposite of dog in some logical sense is like not dog, right? The opposite of dog is not dog. But we're sort of disinclined from that because that just means there's nothing there, and our brain doesn't handle that well. There are a lot of different answers you can give. What's the opposite of dog, right? But cat is weird. It's a strange answer, right? It's a little bit arbitrary. You can see how it's culturally influenced. If we kept something else as a pet, I don't know, monitor lizards, would we think of those as being opposite to dogs? So you can see that it's a little bit arbitrary, and it's a deep-rooted arbitrary distinction. I mean, the Bible mentions dogs 18 times, doesn't even mention cats once, despite the fact that, according to the story, they were enslaved in a country that treated cats as objects of religious veneration. So it's a bit odd. But the point is that these things are not opposite in the same way as something is logically opposite. And often when I'm telling people about alchemy, or when I'm getting people to work with certain kinds of oppositions they have, part of the game around it is to attempt to soften the apparent opposition between those things. Now, one way of achieving this that I think is sort of useful to mention, well, actually, we'll deal with a couple, but one way to think about it that is useful is the notion of sensibility transcendence. Sensibility transcendence. So derived from Levinas, I think. Yeah. So sensibility transcendence. So the notion of sensibility transcendence is essentially, it's a kind of charitable reinterpretation of events. So the classic version of this is, here's a mother-in-law, she's dealing with her new daughter-in-law, and she sees her daughter-in-law as being loud and obnoxious, right? She's loud, obnoxious, she's rude, right? And it's really rubbing the mother-in-law the wrong way. But then she goes to a kind of shift, a shift of being charitable, right? Of extending charity in the direction. She's like, well, maybe she's not loud. Maybe she's boisterous. She's enthusiastic. And maybe she's not rude. Maybe she's direct. And maybe she's not, sort of crass, right? She's like earthy, right? Or like down to earth in some sense. Sensibility transcendence is this kind of flip in the valence of the experience of the traits without affecting the kind of content per se, but it completely affects the interpretation of that content, right? The change in the valence affects the interpretation of that content, and obviously makes that person considerably more appealing. You're much more likely to want to spend time with somebody who is boisterous as opposed to somebody who is loud and rude, right? So this idea of sensibility transcendence as a way of being able to create a closer and more palatable connection with somebody is one important thing. We can see that there is a version of this also present in Michael Apter's notion of reversal theory. So we talked about this a little bit before when we talked about the classic experiment where people get the injection of adrenaline, and there are sort of two groups of Confederates, that is to say professional actors, experimental actors. And brief aside here, I've never gotten around to writing this up, but there is a real problem that I actually see in Confederate-based psychology designs, which is that there are a lot of channels of information that are available to people that would unconsciously sort of lend confirmation, disconfirmation when somebody is acting. So like we pick up cues in people's sweat, for instance, about their emotional states. That's been replicated on a number of occasions. If you get somebody to watch scary movie stuff, if you get somebody to watch horror or terrifying images, or you get them to watch sort of, titillating or perhaps sexual images, and you collect their sweat, if you expose somebody to that sweat, they're going to register different reactions dependent, right? So it's not quite full pheromonal. There isn't very good evidence that humans use pheromones, but it's very clear that we're picking up on different kinds of cues. And that's just one channel of information. To my way of thinking, that makes Confederate-based designs, at the very least, this is something that needs to be accounted for. Because just because you're pretending to be terrified or something doesn't mean that you are literally, sweating it out. We'll talk about this when we talk about actors next week. So Okay, but the basic Confederate-based design is you give everybody a shot of norepinephrine, or you give all the experimental subjects a shot of norepinephrine, adrenaline, and they are exposed to Confederates in one of two groups. The one group acts excited, the other group acts fearful. That context-dependent situation will skew the interpretation of the person receiving a shot, so that although they've received an identical chemical, the group that is associated with the fearful Confederates will behave fearfully or anxiously, and the group that is with the excited Confederates will behave excitedly and joyfully. Same stimulus, different response. Ditto classic experiment where you expose somebody to butyric acid, which is a very strong odor, and one group you tell them it's a fine cheese, and the other group you tell them it's vomit. And the group that is told it's a fine cheese catches a whiff of it and says, provided they like cheese, which I do, they say, and they savor it. And the group who you tell this is vomit will begin gagging. So even something that we think of as being sort of biologically foundational as disgust is clearly highly conditioned by context cues and interpretation, right? There is a kind of reversal that can go on by context cue and interpretation. Similarly, Apter points out that the way that we parse certain states of activation is a two-axis system. There is sort of our level of energy, but then there is also our hedonic tone, right? There is the valence of pleasurable or unpleasurable. So if we are highly activated and it's pleasurable, we're excited. And if we're highly activated and it's unpleasurable, we're anxious. If, right, we feel keyed up. If we are sort of low energy, low activation, and it's pleasurable, we're relaxed. But if we're low energy and it's unpleasurable, we're bored, right? And, you know, Apter has a kind of crossover system. Michael Apter's work is fascinating, and I highly recommend it to anybody. His book, Reversal Theory, is an absolute blast, such a gold mine. I wish there were more theorists that did sort of broad spanning work of that kind. But anyway, you know, there are numerous potential applications of this. One of them that I like to point out to people is that in a large part, the consumer capitalist advertising industry, which I used to work in, is concerned with making you flip between your hedonic tones in order to get you to buy things, right? So boredom and anxiety are the two primary buttons that get pushed over and over and over again, right? And in so doing, of course, they move you away from to borrow the terminology from Eric Fromm, they move you away from being needs and towards having needs, which is to say they don't get you to ask questions about your internal state and how becoming more might solve the problem. Instead, they get you into acquiring things implicitly or explicitly as a way of solving those problems. Are you bored? You need things, right? Are you anxious? You need things, right? Things. So switching between these states in reversal theory is pretty central to the way our economic engine works, unfortunately, because it's manipulative. And we'll talk more about that later too. But the point is that kind of flipping, okay, between things is also a kind of tool, this sort of recontextualization that you can engage in with something. And the idea is that typically two perceived opposites can be perceived as opposite in one aspectual frame. But it's possible to engage in a kind of sensibility transcendence and a kind of reversal, a contextual shift that reveals that there is more similarity than difference, right? That they are not never the twin shall meet, but that rather there is some kind of commonality between them. And that commonality, as per the Transcendent Function, is going to yield some kind of synthetic third, right? Now that synthetic third may, in a sense, stand apart from the other two. But I want to point out that even with something like opponent processing, right, there really are multiple states that we're talking about. So with something like opponent processing, you can imagine the state that pulls over this side. Well, that's very simple, right? Okay. Or the state that pulls over this side. That's very simple. Then there is a neutral state, which is no tension at all. Nothing is pulling. But there is also the state where there is an equal amount of force being pulled in both directions, right? This is different than the relaxed state, even though it's centered in some sense. It's different than the relaxed state, even though it's centered. And in fact, that tension is what we find operating in systems of opponent process in biology. So talking previously about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, it's not that, you know, they're not really in operation. They're in fact pulling on each other all the time. One pulls this way, the other pulls this way, right? They're constantly operating on each other, attempting to shut each other off while activating themselves. there is an opponency to it that yields this kind of collective tension. But because of that tension, they're highly responsive circumstantially. Circumstances change, the system is already under tension and it moves where it needs to move. Well, it's the same thing with introducing opponent process in an attentional framework, right? Like the one that we've been talking about. Having these two things under tension means essentially you're strengthening both, but you're also possibly yielding some depth-producing synthetic third state, right? That the apparent opposition of these two things is not as oppositional as it might seem, and that it may yield a synthetic third state, that it may yield a kind of depth, a kind of penetrating depth. So, okay, that was a little bit about integration. So the reason that I want to talk about that kind of convergence, that kind of integration, that kind of depth, right, the transcendent function, synthesis, simultaneity, is to point out how we can begin to bridge, in a certain sense, the material that we've already been talking about into sort of experiences more broadly of the mystical, but also into higher realms of altered states. Because this is one of the propositions that I made early on, right? That, you know, the upshot, in a sense, of combinatorial explosion, of the number of possible ways in which your systems can combine and recombine, right? The problem with it is that it makes it hard to understand the system. We want to be able to map it in some exhaustive sense, and it's like, right? It becomes an intractably large, unimaginably large number very quickly. But the upside of that is that that means that the number of potential states of integration and synthesis, right, the number of emergent functions that can occur as things are recombined is also vast. So, you know, if you consider sort of stacking psychotechnologies on top of other psychotechnologies and yielding states that are not easy to enter on demand, and then being able to combine those with other states, you begin to get this sense of a kind of dialectic progression of both cognitive capacity, right, but also states, altered states of construal, altered states of consciousness, altered states of emotion, altered states of identity, and so on and so forth. But these things can stack together in a way that provides a kind of existential depth that would not otherwise be present, and that is virtually unimaginable if you are operating without that particular integration. It's very hard to imagine. So if you only had one eye, it would be extremely hard to convey depth to you, right? Well, it's like my two eyes put it together and there's like a whole, right? This is a classic kind of flatland problem. So if you're familiar with the classic late 19th century sort of short allegorical novel, Flatland, right? Flatland is a story about, you know, a land of shapes. It's a cool story. It's worth reading. But it's about a land of shapes, right? There's like a caste system of circles and triangles and squares and stuff interacting with each other. And the idea is that they live in a two-dimensional universe. And what are the implications of that? And I think the main character is a sphere who drops in. And of course, so, geez, I should reread it. It's a sphere who drops in. And so from their perspective, right, he is a circle that can change size, but that can suddenly vanish and appear on the other side of barriers, right? There is a dimensionality present that they find sort of hard to track. Well, in the same way, there is a dimensionality present to depth that if you do not have access to it, would be quite striking. And furthermore, there is a cognitive dimensionality present to the integration of things that's exceptionally difficult to convey if somebody has not gone through a similar state of integration, right? Trying to convey the concept of bittersweet nostalgia to a child is like basically impossible, right? You can convey notions like sad, you can explain it, but do they really get it, right? Well, often they don't until they experience it, right? Until they happen to have the particular experience. And even then, right, they may be experiencing those things to different depth, right? Not everybody is going to have the same degree of facility with emotions in a general sense, and not everybody is going to have sort of the same palette of emotional facility, right? People are going to have more experience in some directions than others, more conscious access in some directions than others, etc. So the point is that there are certain forms of depth which may become available to us, provided that we build certain kinds of psychotechnologies to integrate together certain kinds of states in a certain kind of order. And there are a great number of esoteric systems right? But also religious systems that very specifically delineate these kinds of steps and stages. So although we will spend more time on this when we sort of do Inside of the Mountain, right? There is often a progression that occurs that you see in sort of the like basic original kind of Hindu meditation texts, okay, which are like a set of progressive mergers, right? So it's like merging with an object, and then it's losing a set of subject to object barriers, entering a state of non-duality, and eventually entering a state of sort of cosmic union, right? Is often this kind of penultimate or ultimate state. It's a state of cosmic union. That corresponds in the mindful dimension with what Robert Foreman has called the pure consciousness event. And Foreman's claim, and without registering an ad hominem attack against Foreman, Foreman claims to be enlightened. He claims he reached enlightenment, but without being ad hominem about it, my reading around Foreman seems to indicate that he is often not a very nice person. And so a little bit, I trend towards the idea that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. For one, I'm always deeply skeptical when somebody claims to be enlightened. But also, you know, when, you know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? If that enlightenment hasn't yielded like ethical improvement and he's behaving in a nasty fashion, then it's even more difficult for me to accept any kind of supposed spiritual advancement. And that's not to say, of course, that there is some kind of instantaneous transition that once somebody attains a higher state of consciousness, they're necessarily like across the board now going to be a nice person. I suspect that like most of these things, this is something that occurs on a spectrum by degree, right? And there are obviously, as I mentioned, plenty of accounts of saints being curmudgeonly and weird, even though they have access. But his specific claim that he has attained enlightenment doesn't seem to square off very well with his sort of social and ethical behavior to me. Anyway, leaving that aside, Foreman delineates a set of sort of such stages, and at the top of this, he puts the pure consciousness event, where the pure consciousness event is, as he frames it, an event where consciousness is sort of deeply empty. It's simply consciousness being aware of itself. There is no referent. Now, for most people, that's going to seem to be a contradiction in terms. People think of consciousness in terms, for the most part, of its intentionality, right? One is conscious of something. One is conscious, you know, one requires an object of consciousness. If there's no sort of phenomenal consciousness, if you're not experiencing qualia, you're not conscious, most people would say. However, I would bring up a couple of qualifications in that respect. So one is, it's not strictly speaking the case that the pure consciousness event is non-referential. Properly speaking, the pure consciousness event seems to be minimally self-referential, meaning that it is a very tight loop where consciousness is conscious of itself, right? That's a small distinction, but it's an important one, right? It's still pointing, it's just pointing at itself in a, as appeals to my Jungian nature, a highly aerobric fashion, like the snake eating its own tail, okay? So it's properly speaking, probably a minimally self-referential system rather than a non-referential state. The other thing is that it seems as though the objection that we often have, and this comes out of sort of work I co-authored with John Vervaeke on the subject, it seems as though the common notion that we have that any state of consciousness necessarily has to have qualia, right, sense impressions, right, sort of redness and blueness and songness and taste, and right, these sense impressions. The idea that consciousness necessarily has to have qualia attached to it fails to make a certain kind of distinction. And the distinction is between what we have called adjectival qualia and adverbial qualia. So adjectival qualia are the redness of red, the saltiness of ham, the smoothness of silk, right? These are adjectival qualia, right? They are these kinds of what we normally think of as qualia, property qualia. However, there's a secondary class of qualia in the sense that we think about less, which is adverbial qualia. This is the here-ness and the nowness and the thisness of things. And we know that those are independent properties because of experiments by the cognitive science scientist at Western University in London, Ontario, Zenon Polishin, who looked at our ability to track independent objects in a moving frame. So basically you get, say, a blue triangle and a yellow circle or something, and it's bouncing around. And below a certain level, you can track its location, but also its properties. However, above a certain level, you can continue to track the motion of these things, but if they engage in a spontaneous shift, if a blue triangle suddenly becomes a yellow circle, you don't notice. There is a kind of change blindness above a certain point. And as we discussed, change blindness in general is one of these phenomena that people tend not to be aware of, but is operating pretty routinely. So you can still sort of keep track of the locations of all the objects, but they seem to be sort of minimally indexed. You're not getting the actual qualia of them, the color, the shape, right? You're just getting a kind of indexical point, there-ness and a now-ness to them, right? So that tends to separate the idea out, right? That there are in fact multiple kinds of qualia. And part of our proposition around the pure consciousness event is that although the pure consciousness event excludes adjectival qualia, the kinds of things that we typically think of as being properties, sensory properties, it nevertheless still includes adverbial qualia. There is still a very pregnant sense of presence, right? So there is a presence and a coherence and a here-ness and a now-ness to it, even though there is no other content. It is minimally self-referential. Now, that you can imagine, it's not an easy state to get to, although people do apparently enter it spontaneously sometimes. There's lots of interesting cases described in sort of religious and mystical literature of people having the sudden breakthrough, and indeed in contemporary texts too. So people who just like, it just sort of goes off. It does seem to happen spontaneously, and that's reflected in the literature. Sometimes that can happen briefly. Sometimes it's the sort of thing that happens to people for an hour or a day, and then they come back down and then go looking for it. Sometimes it seems to be a permanent change where people can experience one of these relatively high level sort of states and are simply transformed by it. But for most people, they seem to be working their way through a set of techniques, using a set of psychotechnologies in order to proceed, to train themselves in the direction of having a state of this kind, which I add would be like way, way down in the super far corner. It's like so far down into featural and opaque that you've basically reduced all of the potential sort of elaborative reference, right, down to this, as I said, minimally self-referential loop, all right, excluding almost all qualia. It's going to be an extremely powerful space down in this corner. So what's the counterpoint? And the counterpoint, of course, in that system would be these highly visionary experiences, right? And people certainly do report numerous kinds of highly visionary experiences, often in the form of what we typically refer to as prophecy. Now, prophecy as a term is something that we have come to associate with predictions of the future. And that is not, it doesn't entirely capture it. It can have that quality, but very often it's a kind of delivered and revelatory vision about the present. And that obviously may unfold into the future. There may be sort of trends there that may contain that content, but it's a kind of breakthrough, right? Dirk Bruck visionary experience is mostly what constitutes sort of prophecy, often around a sort of super gestalt, the fate of a nation, the fate of a people, the fate of the world, this kind of thing, right? So there's like a very high level super gestalt and a hyper transparency where one is seen to sort of shred the veil of regular presentation and penetrate through into some space of sort of super saturated significance. So this is a state that is described through various kinds of literature, various religious traditions, and so on and so forth. Now, I don't want to be perennialist about this, which is to say that there's a trend, and as I think I mentioned previously, the perennialist philosophy, or the perennial philosophy, rather, by Aldous Huxley, has for a long time been one of my favorite books. I read it many, many times. As a young person. It was sort of one of the two books that I carried around in my pocket. And as a repository of wisdom, I think it's terrific. It's a good kind of carry-all of mystical reminder. However, the perennial philosophy, I think, errs insofar as it treats every religious tradition as being identical, right? That they're all talking about the same thing. It's all one state. Now, the counterpoint to the perennial philosophy is a kind of constructivist and culturally located version, which is like, no, they're all talking about completely different things, right? There is no relationship between these things, and it's foolish to attempt to, right? It seems fairly obvious to me, like the question, nature or nurture, is it genes or is it environment? It's like, it's both. It's both. That doesn't seem like an interesting argument to me. It seems pretty obvious that it's both. And the balance, of course, can shift, right? Yes, sometimes it's genetic. It's a question of inheritance. Of course it is sometimes, right? Like, how would that not be a factor? And yet sometimes, obviously, the intervening power of culture and conditions can make a huge difference, not just to how genetic material expresses, and see epigenetics for these sort of strange loops, but also just because all of this context cue stuff means that culture and our categorization, our systems of categorization, are going to have a profound impact on how things turn out and express for us in various ways. So that nature versus nurture question is not that interesting to me. Typically, I'm not sure why we keep having it. Similarly, okay, are these states all totally identical, or are they all completely distinct? Well, the answer, it seems to me, is, well, sort of both. So if we think about this in state space terms, there are obviously going to be states that are, comparatively speaking, low-hanging fruit. There are going to be states that, given the basic inherited components, right? So link back here to Panksepp circuitry, to shared cultural circuitry, to our sort of shared biological systems, right? There are going to be certain kinds of things that are biologically brought on board. They're part of our basic wiring. There are going to be other things that are universal by dint of being impressed features of the environment, right? We may not be born with a natural sense of how gravity operates, but all of us are subject to gravity from the time we're born. And so all of us are going to form the same inferential patterns probably around gravity. We're all going to come to the same set of ideas, and that's environmentally impressed. It doesn't need to be pre-programmed. But then on top of those things, right, there's culture. And so individuals within a similar culture are going to tend to acquire comparatively similar, right? There are things that you and, say, your siblings in a family will be able to understand very readily that other people in your culture won't. And people that you and other people in your culture will be able to understand very readily that people in another culture won't, and so on, right? So there's going to be degrees of similarity in that sense. But part of our shared biological inheritance is almost certainly going to be that there are certain kinds of states that are going to be relatively low-hanging fruit, right? Ways of combining, especially given sort of our natural and cultural environment, that are going to produce certain kinds of states. And those states may be, in a sense, sort of natural set points or natural fixed points within the system, right? If indeed we can take the very loose map of this sort of two-dimensional two-axis system we've been talking about, right, as part of the sort of state space of altered states, then it seems clear that, of course, moving in a certain dimensional direction is going to yield something that is very similar phenomenologically between people, even if there are differences in specific content and differences in cultural interpretation. So where one person might move into a state of, say, union and a dissolution between the objective and subjective, a kind of union with the world, one person might interpret that as a state of like emptiness and process, and another person might interpret it as fusing with the mind of God, right? Atman is Brahman. The point is that the context of interpretation is probably going to alter what that experience means for you and how it signifies. There are going to be other states, on the other hand, that are going to be probably less accessible depending on where you're coming from culturally. The material that you have to work with is going to make things easier and harder. It's going to change your access to certain kinds of psychotechnologies. And that almost certainly means that there is, in fact, differentiation. So there may, in fact, be clusters of similarity, and this is like a family resemblance category problem. There are going to be clusters of similarity, but I think it's a mistake to just boil all that down into the perennialist. We're all talking about the same thing. However, there is a general framework that we can operate this in. We can start to sketch this state space out and say, oh, okay, these are union experiences and they operate differently between a bunch of different cultures. There's, individual and significant differences that can be explored, and those differences matter. We don't want to erase them and simply collapse it. But at the same time, to pretend that they have no relationship to each other at all sort of seems to miss a great deal to me. It actually strikes me as exceedingly unlikely and strange that would be the case. So I want to start putting those things on a framework. Okay, and because we're covering off a bunch of this later, I wanted to talk about Dark Night of the Soul, but I don't want to drag this one too long. Okay, I'll talk about it super briefly and then I'll close off. So Dark Night of the Soul. Mystical experiences, and we'll discuss this more later, but mystical experiences don't simply come in joyful and friendly flavors. Sometimes they come in extremely unpleasant flavors. So you can compare this a little bit to when I was talking about excessive transparency in relationship to things like psychosis, where things signify, right? There's excess meaning. And as I've often said to people, people seem to think they want more meaning in their life, as though that is something, you know, I want to be taller. Yeah, but you don't want to be 100 feet tall, right? Because then your heart would give out. Like, this is a relative question. So you want more meaning in your life because you feel that you have a deficit of meaning. But if you talk to somebody who's had a psychotic episode or just gone on a psychedelic trip, they are not interested in having more meaning right now. What they want is for things to be less meaningful, right? They just want their bowl of oatmeal to sit there and be oatmeal and not signify anything else. Similarly, there are lots of conditions, as I've mentioned, where it's sort of advantageous in the moment for us to slide the meaning slider, right, around a little bit. Sometimes we want things to mean less. Sometimes we want it to be mechanism, right? So there are circumstances depending, right? Having sort of too much free will, for instance, right? The idea of moving away from mechanism and towards sort of meaning in a sense of free will is bound to be, for many people, kind of crippling. It creates a terrible sense of responsibility in some cases, especially given the limits of our agency. And in that case, often, right, people will slide themselves. They'll say, well, you couldn't have really done any differently. You chose what you could. You know, we'll move ourselves in the direction of determinism and mechanism. So we slide around in this space of both meaning and free will and agency. And we do it depending on the needs of the circumstances. To be locked in one place or another is not so good. So in talking about this, right, it's possible to reach a state of excess signification. That's often what happens in sort of a negative paranoid psychotic episode. Things signify enormously, and then people attempt to explain that. And provided they can stay in a relatively positive hedonic tone, right, then God loves them and everything's okay, right? Everything is intensely meaningful and it's great. But if things flip to a negative hedonic tone, if they're not having a good time, it's scaring them, then that's going to tend to influence their interpretation. And if they're still in a relatively naturalist frame, they're going to tend to be like, you know, people, the CIA is spying on me, or they have a computer chip in my head or something, right? But if it slides past that, where things just cannot be explained without recourse to the supernatural, and this is, you know, a rational set of explanations given what people are experiencing in terms of their construal, then people are going to tend to come up with supernatural explanations, typically Gnostic ones, right? I'm being plagued by supernatural beings, or I'm trapped in hell, or so on and so forth. The version of that that applies into the mystical experience is the Dark Night of the Soul, and it comes in a couple of flavors. There's the active Dark Night of the Soul, which is very similar to the kind of experience you're having. It would be like encountering the fear and horror of God, right? Confronting face on the problem of evil. There's an immense amount of meaning, but what you can't do is square off the hedonic tone, right? So the idea of a vast divine pattern or something, right, becomes quite obvious to you. It's like a metaphysical principle that confronts you. But nevertheless, there are features of it you're trying to share, right? So reference back here to Darwin and the Sphex wasp. You are faced with sphexing problems, but in a metaphysically inescapable phenomenological fashion, right? So you're sort of smashed with this and crushed under the weight of evil. That's one version of the Dark Night. But the other version of the Dark Night is for, in a sense, the snap back on the meaning frame to occur and to snap you into the negative hedonic tone. So that would be the negative hedonic of the Gestalt and the transparent. But the negative hedonic version at the other end, the featural and the opaque, is a kind of nihilistic meaninglessness. And sometimes that can show up by degrees. So a friend of mine who's now a philosophy prof once had an experience where he went to the park and he suddenly experienced in a direct confrontation Darwinian competition. So he experienced like every blade of grass and every dandelion like struggling to outcompete and stretch and reach to get taller than each other to like escape death. And so he had this direct experience of Darwinian competition that was extremely unpleasant, right, to sort of be thrust into. Now, because he is a philosopher, he has some training in one of these tasks that you do implicitly, I think, when you study philosophy, but that it's not often discussed, which is you have some training in internalizing a metaphysic. So when you're reading a philosopher, there's often a shift where you go from simply reading them and appreciating them in a sort of propositional sense to internalizing them in a perspectival sense. You take them in and you learn to see through the metaphysic. You inhabit the metaphysic in a certain way. So he had some experience with this, but it's still the case that he could get swamped in a certain sense by this metaphysic, right? He experienced a dark night of Darwinian hellscapery. That's not an uncommon one these days. Mechanistic hellscapes are the kinds of things that clients and people I know complain about regularly, feeling trapped in like a deterministic Darwinian scape or being trapped in a deterministic Newtonian hellscape, right? It's this idea that like nothing is meaningful and we're just gene machines and love isn't real, and right? Now I have numerous objections to this and sort of ways to sort of deconstruct it. I think that that particular materials framework is not on very good philosophical footing, quite frankly. But of course, it does have a lot of cultural heft behind it. And so it can come at people with the appearance of authority, which is very, very powerful, that like appearance of authority. And we will talk more shortly, next lecture, actually, about this question around certainty, because that also plays into this material. But to reach a state of like absolute nihilism and emptiness, right? A total meaninglessness and just the entropic drag, like a black hole underneath all reality, that's another form of dark night, right? The abyss, as it were. To sort of hover over the abyss and feel like the insignificance, the absurdity, the meaninglessness, but amplified, of course, by the dimensions of your practice. Because as you get better at pushing into these altered states, the way that they can snap back and snap you around is likewise going to become considerably intensified. The expanded ability that you have to move into these spaces intentionally is also going to mean that sometimes when the system wheels on you, it's going to push you much further than it might push the average person who does not have that kind of expanded state space. So this is one of the dangers of pursuing a kind of mystical path, this question of emptiness and plenitude, that emptiness and plenitude themselves, like the vacuum and the plenum, right, the emptiness and the fullness, can have their own hedonic dimensions to them, right? And indeed their own meaning tone, somewhat independently of that. Things can be bustlingly full, but totally meaningless and horrible, or bustlingly full and totally meaningless and wonderful, or right? So there are different dimensions here. But the point is that emptiness and plenitude themselves, while they can be, okay, individual states that can be sort of pleasant and elucidating, and that can also be integrated together into a kind of higher synthetic state, when we're talking about prajna, also, they can have this negative hedonic frame. Things can be the abyss, the void, but they can also be like the raging, churning chaos. And so that's a space too. So it's a little bit about Dark Night. We will continue on Dark Night as we talk about sort of insight and insights on the mountain, but I wanted to flag that. Okay, so this one has already gone longer than I anticipated. So hopefully I didn't overstay my conversational welcome. And yeah, next week we will be talking about, oh yeah, left hand, right hand, head and heart, which is to say that we'll be talking about systems of art and systems of rationality, mathematics, etc. We'll be talking about left and right hand paths a bit. So we'll be talking about all of the various ways that one, to borrow the term from the poet Rimbaud, engages in the systematic derangement of the senses in order to navigate these spaces. Because again, as I'm saying, right, especially when we're talking about the Dark Night and being thrust into Darwinian hellscapes, intentional navigation. The more you learn how to navigate, the easier it is to deal with these things when they pounce on you. And frankly, the best way to train that is to go looking for them before they come looking for you. Okay, see you next week.